The pastor disappeared after a sermon in 1997. 26 years later, his son finds a Bible in the forest. The Bible was discovered lodged in the roots of a lightning-struck tree in the forest near his old home, 26 years after the pastor, his father, vanished. The raw, immediate shock, the feel of the decaying leather, the unnatural preservation of the pages within, a jolt, a tear in the fabric of time, the past rushing up to meet him with the scent of damp earth and something else. Something like forgotten fear. He hadn't been back to this specific part of the woods, the part that always felt colder, denser, since he was a boy, since the days before the whispers started. Before the church doors closed on his father's memory with a sound like a coffin lid. The tree itself, a skeletal monument, split down the middle, its bark charred and peeling, yet cradling this impossible relic. He remembered the storm, or rather, the stories of the storm that had raged the week his father disappeared, a storm that people said mirrored the turmoil in the pastor's soul. But this Bible, nestled here, felt less like an act of God and more like a carefully placed marker, a message left to steep in the elements, waiting. He knelt, the damp leaves compressing under his worn boots, his breath catching in his throat, a sudden, inexplicable dread mixing with a surge of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel for over 2 decades. A fragile, terrifying hope. The clasp was rusted, stubborn, but it gave with a grating screech, and as he thumbed open the cover, the first thing he saw isn't scripture, but his father's looping, meticulous handwriting. A date scrawled beneath a single, desperate word. A date from long after the world had declared him dead. The world had spun on, oblivious, while this book, this testament, lay silent, waiting for the earth to finally give up its dead, or at least, its secrets. The air around him felt thick, charged, as if the forest itself held its breath, anticipating the unraveling of a carefully woven lie. He could almost hear the faint echo of his father's voice, not the booming orator of the pulpit, but a quieter, more desperate whisper carried on the same breeze that now rustled the leaves above. A breeze that seemed to carry the scent of old paper, old pain, and the first, terrifying hint of a truth more profound and disturbing than any sermon on damnation. The name, his father's name, Pastor Alistair Finch, echoed in the hollow chambers of memory, a name that had once been synonymous with unwavering faith, with sermons that could make the stained glass rattle and the most hardened hearts crack open with sudden, unexpected light. Now it was a name buried under layers of conjecture, of shame, of a scandal that had ripped through their small, tightly knit community like a contagion, leaving behind a residue of suspicion and a quiet, collective grief that never quite healed. 1997. A year etched into his mind not by the changing seasons or youthful milestones, but by the abrupt silence that fell after that final Sunday service, a silence so profound it seemed to swallow all sound, all hope. His father standing at the pulpit, his face unusually pale, his familiar wire-rimmed glasses perched precariously on his nose, his voice, usually so resonant, so sure, carrying a tremor that only those closest to him, perhaps only his young son watching from the front pew with wide, uncomprehending eyes, could truly discern. There had been whispers for weeks, ugly, insidious things that slithered through the town like vipers in the grass, rumors of misappropriated funds, of a secret life conducted in the shadows, of a fall from grace so profound, so complete, it seemed to defy the very essence of the man they thought they knew, the man who had baptized their children and buried their dead. Alistair had addressed none of it directly, not in public, not from the sacred space of his pulpit. His final sermon had been on the nature of unseen battles, on the wolves in sheep's clothing that stalk even the most faithful flocks, on the pervasive darkness that can gather in the most sacred of places, a darkness that often wore a benign, even pious mask. At the time, it had sounded like profound metaphor, another of his father's complex allegories designed to stir the conscience. Looking back, through the murky lens of 26 years and the impossible, tangible weight of the Bible now resting in his hands, it felt like a desperate, coded confession, or perhaps a final, unheeded warning. The son, Thomas, had been just 10 years old then, old enough to sense the oppressive atmosphere in the church that day, the strained smiles on the faces of the congregation, the way parishioners avoided his mother's gaze with a sudden, intense interest in their hymnals, but too young to comprehend the full magnitude of the storm that was about to break over their lives. Too innocent to understand the adult complexities of betrayal and disgrace. He remembered his father's hand on his head after the service. A brief, almost convulsive squeeze, a kiss on his forehead that felt colder than usual, a lingering scent of old books and something else. Something akin to fear. Then he was gone, vanished, as if the earth had opened up and swallowed him whole. The official narrative, quickly and almost too neatly cemented by the church elders and a grieving, bewildered congregation, was suicide. Driven by guilt, by the unbearable weight of his sins, Pastor Finch had simply walked away from his life, presumably to end it in some quiet, desolate place where his shame could not be witnessed, where his brokenness could find its final, solitary peace. No note was ever found, no body ever recovered. Just a gaping absence, a void in their lives and in the community, a void that was quickly filled with the poisonous speculation that had choked the life out of Thomas's childhood, that had cast a long, unforgiving shadow over his mother, Eleanor, who withered under the town's pity and unspoken condemnation until she, too, faded from the world just a few years later, a victim of a grief too heavy to carry, a heart broken by more than just loss. Thomas had grown up with the ghost of that scandal, the phantom of a father he both missed with an aching intensity and, for a long time, deeply resented for the abandonment, for the shame that clung to their family name like a shroud. Why leave? Why bring such disgrace upon them? The questions had festered, unanswered, shaping the man he became, quiet, introspective, carrying a sorrow that felt ancient, inherited, a melancholy that settled in his bones. This forest, these trees, had been his refuge then, a place where the whispers couldn't quite reach, though even here, in the deep dappled silence, the quiet often felt accusatory. As if the ancient trees themselves were judging him, judging his father. He hadn't known, couldn't have known, that the forest was not just a refuge, but a vault, patiently holding the truth, waiting for the right moment, the right hand, to unlock its secrets. The discovery of the Bible was not just a finding, it was a summons, a call from a past he thought long buried, a past that was now insisting, with the irrefutable evidence of ink on paper, that its story was far from over. The weight of the Bible felt heavier now, not just with its physical mass of leather and paper, but with the dawning, terrifying implications of that single, impossible date scrawled beneath his father's handwriting. Thomas sat back on his heels, the forest floor damp and cold beneath him, the canopy above filtering the late afternoon sun into a diffuse, almost reverent gloom that seemed to mirror the obscurity of the past. He thought of his mother, Eleanor, how the vibrant colors seemed to drain from her world, from her very being, after Alistair disappeared, as if his absence had leached the light from everything she touched. She, who had always been the pragmatic one, the anchor to his father's sometimes soaring, esoteric pronouncements, the steady hand that managed the household and the church's often chaotic social calendar, had clung to the suicide theory with a ferocity that, in retrospect, seemed almost desperate, a shield against a truth too horrifying to contemplate. It was a neat, albeit tragic, ending. It offered a form of closure, a reason, however painful, for the gaping hole he had left behind. To entertain anything else, any other possibility, was to step into a void of uncertainty, a place perhaps even darker, more chaotic, than the accepted narrative of a fallen man. Had she suspected something more? Had she carried her own unvoiced fears, her own silent questions, her own agonizing doubts to her grave? He would never know. Her journals, which he'd found tucked away in a dusty box after her passing, were filled with scripture, with fervent prayers for Alistair's lost soul, with a bewildered, heartbroken sorrow that bled through the pages, but no hint of suspicion, no trace of any alternative theory, no accusation against anyone but fate and his father's supposed weakness. Or perhaps he hadn't known how to read them then, hadn't possessed the key, the cipher, that now lay open in his lap, its pages whispering of secrets kept for a quarter of a century. The town, too, had needed that closure, that simple, tragic explanation. Pastor Finch, their charismatic leader, their moral compass, had proven fallible, human, tragically flawed. It was a story that, in its own grim way, reaffirmed their own struggles, their own imperfections, making their own smaller sins seem less significant in comparison. A saint brought low. It was easier to mourn a sinner, to pity a man broken by his own transgressions, than to question the foundations of their collective faith. To wonder if the darkness his father had spoken of with such trembling urgency in that final sermon had emanated not from within him, but from somewhere closer, somewhere they all trusted, somewhere within the hallowed walls of the sanctuary itself. Thomas had left the town as soon as he was old enough, fleeing the suffocating pity and the unspoken judgments, seeking anonymity in the sprawling indifference of a distant city. He'd built a life, a career as an archivist, ironically enough, a preserver of other people's pasts, while his own remained a painful, unexamined wound. He had even found a measure of peace, a quiet resignation, but the unresolved silence of his father's departure remained a quiet hum beneath the surface of his days, a splinter lodged too deep to extract, a question mark at the end of his childhood. This return, this solitary hike into the old woods, hadn't been planned. It was an impulse, a strange, irresistible pull he couldn't quite articulate, as if some unseen tether, frayed but not broken, had drawn him back to the place where his childhood had effectively ended, where the world had tilted on its axis. He told himself it was to clear his head, to revisit old haunts before the last parcel of family land, this patch of wild forest, was inevitably sold, the final tie to a past he had tried so hard to outrun, to forget. He hadn't expected to find anything, certainly not this. Not a testament bound in decaying leather, its pages whispering of a life that had continued, in secret, in fear, long after it was supposed to have been extinguished by shame and despair. The forest seemed to watch him, ancient and knowing, its silence no longer benign. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig in the dense undergrowth now sounded less like the natural cadence of the wild, and more like a breath held, a secret straining to be told, a prelude to a revelation. He traced the contours of the lightning-struck tree, its wound a stark black gash against the gray bark, a brutal scar on the face of nature. A conduit, perhaps, between a tormented past and a present about to be irrevocably altered by its resurrection. The very air felt charged, not with the lingering ozone of a long-ago storm, but with the palpable presence of an untold story, a story his father had, it seemed, quite literally, taken to the earth, entrusting it to the silent, patient keeping of the wilderness. With trembling fingers that felt clumsy and numb, Thomas turned the page. The ink was faded, slightly blurred in places as if from moisture or the desperate sweat of the hand that had written it, the hand that had once held his own so firmly, but it was undeniably his father's script. The familiar elegant loops and precise angles now imbued with a terrible urgency. The entry was dated a full week after the day Pastor Alistair Finch had officially ceased to exist, a week after the town had begun its hushed mourning for a man they believed lost to despair. They watched the house, it began, the words small, cramped, as if afraid of taking up too much space on the page, of being overheard even in their silent inscription. They think I am broken, that I will break, but the Lord is my shepherd. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow, this valley is deeper than I knew, darker than any hell I preached. Thomas's breath hitched, a painful snag in his chest. This wasn't the rambling of a guilty man contemplating an escape from shame, nor the disjointed thoughts of one on the brink of self-destruction. This was the voice of someone hunted, someone in hiding, someone clinging to faith as their only lifeline in an ocean of fear. He scanned the page, his eyes devouring the words, each one a small explosion in the quiet landscape of his long-held assumptions. There were references to Scripture, not quoted in full, but cited with chapter and verse, Psalm 23, of course, the Shepherd's Psalm, but others too, verses of persecution, of hidden enemies, of false witness, of the righteous man ensnared by the wicked. The sanctuary is defiled, another line read, stark and accusatory, not by my sins, as they will claim, but by theirs. They twist the word to serve their own idols, mammon, power, the deaf, dumb idol of their own pristine reputation. I tried to warn them. I tried to cleanse the temple as he did. His father's last sermon, it hadn't been metaphor, it had been a direct confrontation, a declaration of war. A war he had, apparently, lost in a way Thomas could never have imagined, a war that had driven him from his home, his church, his life, into the desolate refuge of the wilderness. He flipped further, the brittle pages crackling in the heavy silence of the woods, a sound like dry bones stirring. Entry after entry, spanning weeks, then months, a desperate chronicle of survival. The handwriting grew more erratic at times, sloping downwards as if mirroring a flagging spirit, then would settle back into his father's familiar, steady hand, as if resolve had been momentarily, fiercely regained. Some entries were purely prayer, raw, anguished pleas for guidance, for strength, for deliverance from unseen tormentors. Others were observations, brief, cryptic notes about sounds in the forest, the distant baying of dogs, the crunch of footsteps on dry leaves, the murmur of voices carried on the wind. About dwindling supplies of pilfered food, about the changing light through the dense canopy, a prisoner's meticulous cataloging of his changing cell, suggesting he had been out here, in this wilderness, for a significant, terrifying period. The old root cellar near the fallen oak, one entry noted, dated almost 2 months after his disappearance, a small, precise drawing of a leaf beside it. A temporary refuge. God provides, even in the desolation. But the nights are cold, and the heart is colder still with the knowledge of their malice. A root cellar? Thomas's mind raced, sifting through the detritus of childhood memories. There were several old abandoned farmsteads deeper in these woods, remnants of a time before the town had grown around the church, their skeletal remains slowly being reclaimed by the encroaching forest. He'd explored them as a boy, playing games of make-believe, never imagining one might become a real-life sanctuary, or perhaps a makeshift prison. The entries painted a picture of a man stripped bare, reduced to his most elemental needs, sustained by a desperate faith and an equally desperate fear. There was no mention of the scandal he was accused of, no admission of guilt for the misappropriated funds or the alleged secret life. Instead, there was a growing, horrifying sense of betrayal, of a conspiracy he had stumbled upon, one that had sought to silence him with brutal efficiency. They cannot let the truth surface, a later entry stated, the ink darker here, pressed harder into the page as if by a hand trembling with conviction or fury. It would unravel everything. Their reputations, their carefully constructed facade of piety, their comfortable deceits. They would rather destroy one man, sacrifice him on the altar of their lies, than see their kingdom fall. Who were they? The church elders, with their solemn faces and somber pronouncements of sorrow. The respected deacons who had looked so mournful, so concerned, as they announced the pastor's presumed demise and offered comfort to his grieving wife and son. The men who had patted Thomas on the head with feigned sympathy, their eyes holding a glint he had been too young, too trusting, to interpret. A cold anger began to smolder beneath Thomas's shock, a righteous fury he hadn't felt since he was a child, raging against the unfairness of a world that had stolen his father and branded him a coward, a thief, a hypocrite. The forest, his childhood escape, now felt like a crime scene, vast and indifferent, holding its secrets close, its shadows deeper, more menacing. The wind whispered through the leaves, carrying not the comforting scent of pine and damp earth, but the stale, metallic odor of fear, of a truth buried alive, crying out from the dust. The journal entries, day by painstaking, fear-etched day, continued to unspool a narrative so far removed from the accepted history, the one Thomas had internalized and lived with for 26 years, that he felt as if he were reading a script from a nightmare, a dark, twisted inversion of everything he thought he knew. His father, Alistair, the man of God, the pillar of the community, had not fled in shame. He had been forced into hiding, a fugitive in his own backyard, hunted by an enemy he had once called brethren, by men he had trusted, men with whom he had broken bread. The entries detailed a harrowing, almost unimaginable existence. Foraging for berries and roots, desperately trying to remember the scant wilderness survival lore he might have read in books, collecting rainwater in cupped leaves, the constant, gnawing fear of discovery, a metallic taste in his mouth. There were descriptions of near misses, sounds of search parties combing the woods in those early weeks, their voices carrying clearly in the still air. The unnerving barking of dogs that seemed to veer too close to his hiding places. The casual hikers who unknowingly passed within yards of his concealment. Their laughter and light conversation, a stark contrast to his silent terror. I saw young Timothy Smallwood today, leading a group from the youth fellowship on a nature walk. One entry read, the pain palpable in the script, the ink slightly smudged as if by a tear. He looked so earnest, so full of faith. Do they tell him I was a thief, a charlatan, a man who betrayed their trust? Does he pray for my damned soul, as they have instructed? Oh, my son, my Thomas, what will they tell you? What poison will they pour into your young ears? The direct address, so unexpected, so raw, so filled with paternal anguish, struck Thomas like a physical blow. He closed his eyes, the image of his 10-year-old self, confused and grieving, his small hand clutching his mother's, superimposed over the damp leaves and decaying wood at his feet. His father had been thinking of him, worrying about him, even in the midst of his own terror, his own desperate fight for survival. The shame Thomas had carried for so long, the faint, lingering resentment that had always colored his memories of his father, began to curdle into a profound, aching sorrow, not for his own loss, though that was immense, but for his father's unimaginable suffering, his profound isolation. The annotations in the margins of the Bible verses themselves were a revelation, a parallel text of despair and defiance. Scriptures on persecution, on enduring injustice, on the nature of true faith versus institutional corruption were heavily underlined, with notes scribbled beside them in a tiny, almost microscopic hand. They embody this hypocrisy, a warning ignored, to my eternal regret. This is our plight. The plight of all who speak truth to power. It was as if his father had been using the Bible not just for solace, but as an evidentiary document, a spiritual indictment of his accusers, a testament to his own innocence in the face of their calculated malice. A recurring symbol began to appear in the margins, a simple line drawing of a shepherd's crook crossed with what looked like a key, sometimes circled, sometimes with a question mark beside it. Thomas didn't recognize it. Was it a code? a reminder of something specific, a symbol of a truth locked away? The journal entries also spoke, albeit cryptically, of his attempts to gather proof, to find a way to expose the rot he had uncovered within the church's seemingly pristine hierarchy before they silenced him. "I cannot simply vanish and let their lies stand as my epitaph," he wrote, the defiance in his words a stark contrast to the fear that permeated other entries. But how to fight an enemy that wears the cloak of righteousness, that controls the narrative, that holds the hearts of the flock in their deceiving hands? They are masters of illusion. There were mentions of documents he had supposedly secured, ledgers filled with damning figures, letters outlining their plans, things that would incriminate them beyond any doubt. But where were they? Were they lost in the struggle, hidden elsewhere, in a place even more secret than this forest refuge, or had they been the ultimate reason for his final, terrible silencing? The entries became more sporadic after the first few months, the gaps between them longer, sometimes spanning several days. The tone shifted subtly, a deep weariness creeping in, a sense of profound isolation pressing down like the heavy, humid air of the deep woods. "The winter will be hard," one late autumn entry read, the script small and tight as if to conserve warmth, or perhaps hope. "My strength wanes, my body aches with the cold and the damp, but his does not. I must hold to that." He pictured his father, alone in the freezing woods, huddled in some makeshift shelter, the vibrant, commanding man of the pulpit reduced to a hunted animal, his eloquent voice silenced, his spirit battered but not, it seemed, entirely broken. The injustice of it was a physical ache in Thomas's chest, a burning ember of rage. He remembered snippets of conversations from that terrible time, overheard fragments his child's mind hadn't been able to piece together, his mother's worried whispers to his father in the dead of night. Behind their closed bedroom door, hushed, urgent phone calls his father would take in his study, his voice low and tense, his father's increasingly drawn face, the new lines of strain around his eyes in the weeks leading up to that final, fateful sermon. He had seen the signs, the shadows gathering around his father, but had lacked the understanding, the vocabulary, to name them. Now the unnamed dread of his childhood had a shape, a terrifying, concrete form, and it wore the faces of men he had once respected, men who had smiled at him from the pulpit, men who had offered him sweets after the service. One particular journal entry, nestled between a lament about the dwindling daylight of late autumn and a fervent prayer for deliverance from his unseen enemies, caught Thomas's eye. Its structure different from the others. It was less a diary input and more a set of cryptic directions, almost a riddle, penned with a careful, deliberate hand, as if his father knew these words might be his last, most important message. "Where the weeping willow touches the stone of ages, and the stream whispers secrets to the fallen giant, there lies a door unseen by profane eyes. Follow the path of the forgotten saints, those who walked before in shadow and persecution. Count 7 sorrows for the 7 betrayals, then look beneath the gaze of the silent watcher. For it alone sees the truth hidden in the earth." It sounded like something out of a medieval allegory, or one of the fantastical stories his father used to read to him, yet the specificity of the language, the earnestness of the script, suggested otherwise. A weeping willow, a stone, a stream, a fallen giant. These were not mere poetic flourishes, they were landmarks. Landmarks from his childhood explorations, from the countless hours he and the other children from the parish used to spend playing in these very woods, a part of the forest further in, denser, less frequented by casual walkers, bordering the old, derelict Henderson farm, a place adults warned them away from, saying it was haunted by the ghosts of its failed past. The fallen giant was a massive, uprooted oak tree, its colossal trunk and tangled roots forming a natural fortress they dared each other to climb. The Stone of Ages was a large, moss-covered glacial erratic that stood near a narrow, trickling stream, a silent, brooding presence in the woods. And the weeping willow, he remembered it vividly, its long, mournful tendrils trailing into the water, creating a shadowy, secret curtain around its base. A sudden, urgent energy, a jolt of adrenaline mixed with a profound sense of dread, propelled Thomas to his feet. The Bible, clutched tightly in his hand, felt less like a book of scripture and more like a map to a buried kingdom, or perhaps a tomb. He began to move, his steps guided by a strange confluence of adult understanding and deeply buried childhood memory, the images from the journal entry superimposing themselves onto the familiar landscape. He pushed through tangled underbrush, the forest growing thicker, the light dimmer, the sounds of the distant town fading into an almost preternatural silence. It took him nearly an hour, his heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and a growing trepidation, before he found the area described. The stream, a mere trickle now in the late summer, still whispered its secrets over smooth stones. The fallen oak lay where it always had, a monumental corpse slowly surrendering to the embrace of the forest floor. And there, its branches still trailing, though sparser now with the passage of years, was the willow, its roots intertwined with the base of the mossy monolith of the stone, a door unseen. He circled the area, his eyes scanning every rock, every tree trunk, every patch of disturbed earth. Follow the path of the forgotten saints. He remembered a barely discernible track, overgrown now but still faintly visible if one knew where to look, that they used to call Saint's Path because it led towards the crumbling ruins of a tiny, long-abandoned chapel, even older than their own church, a place they'd been told was once used by itinerant preachers, forgotten holy men. 7 Sorrows. What could that mean? He looked around, his gaze falling on a cluster of 7 large gray stones that formed a rough semicircle around the base of the willow, almost like deliberate placements. Or perhaps just a natural formation his child's mind had once imbued with significance. He touched each one, counting under his breath, looked beneath the gaze of the silent watcher. His eyes were drawn upwards into the dense canopy of the willow and then to the massive stone beside it. Was there something carved on it? Moss and lichen obscured much of its surface, a green shroud of centuries. He ran his hands over it, pulling away clumps of damp green and crumbling stone. And there, weathered by time and elements but still discernible, was a crudely etched owl, its eyes wide, unblinking, seeming to stare directly at a point on the ground near the willow's gnarled roots, a spot almost entirely concealed by overhanging branches and a thick accumulation of fallen leaves and forest debris. With a surge of adrenaline that made his hands shake, Thomas knelt and began to clear the debris, clawing at the earth with frantic energy. The earth was soft, looser than the surrounding ground, as if it had been disturbed more recently than 26 years ago. His fingers brushed against something hard, unyielding, wood. He dug frantically, pulling away soil and roots, revealing the faint outline of a heavily weathered wooden hatch, almost perfectly camouflaged, flush with the ground, its surface covered in the same moss and dirt as the forest floor. It was old, the wood warped and dark with moisture, but a small rusted iron ring served as a handle, almost swallowed by the decay. His breath caught in his throat, a painful, suffocating gasp. This was it. This was the door unseen, the place his father had found, or perhaps even made, his sanctuary, his prison, his final hiding place. The silence of the forest pressed in, heavy, expectant, as if all of nature was waiting to see if he would dare to open it, to confront the ghosts within. The iron ring was cold, slick with damp, stiff with rust that flaked away under his touch, resisting his pull like a stubborn secret. With a desperate heave, drawing on a strength born of grief and a terrible burgeoning understanding, Thomas pulled. The hatch groaned, a sound like a coffin lid being forced open, resisting, the sound tearing through the expectant stillness of the woods like a profanity, like a scream held too long. Then, with a sickening crack of rotten wood and the scattering of damp earth and broken roots, it yielded, swinging upwards on rusted hinges to reveal a dark, narrow void, an opening into the earth itself. A wave of musty air, thick with the smell of decay, of confinement, of something else, something indefinably sorrowful, something that spoke of long, lonely hours and fading hope, billowed up, making him recoil, his stomach churning. He fumbled for the flashlight on his phone, its bright, modern beam cutting a stark, inadequate swath into the primordial blackness. Rough-hewn steps, more like notches gouged into the packed earth and reinforced with crumbling pieces of stone, led downwards into the suffocating darkness. This wasn't just a root cellar, not like the shallow ones on the old farms. This was deeper, more deliberately concealed, a burrow dug into the heart of the forest. He hesitated for only a moment, the image of his father's desperate words from the Bible, the impossible dates, the sheer lonely courage of his hidden existence, urging him on, pushing him past his fear. He had to know. He had to see what his father had endured, what secrets this hidden place still held, what final testament it might offer. He descended cautiously, each step creaking ominously, the air growing colder, damper, the silence more profound, broken only by the rhythmic drip of water somewhere in the darkness ahead and the frantic thumping of his own heart. The space below was small, achingly claustrophobic. Perhaps 10 feet square, the ceiling so low he had to stoop, the damp earthen walls pressing in on him. The beam of his light danced across these walls, revealing their raw, unfinished nature, reinforced in places with crudely placed stones and rotting timbers that looked as if they might collapse at any moment. In one corner, a tattered, threadbare blanket lay folded with meticulous care. Beside it, a rusted tin cup and a single burnt-down candle stub in a makeshift holder fashioned from a shard of pottery. Evidence of a desperate, solitary existence, a life reduced to its barest essentials. His father had lived here, hidden like an animal, while the world above mourned a fiction. The thought was a fresh stab of grief, sharp and visceral. Then, his light fell upon a small, unassuming wooden crate tucked into another corner, covered with a ragged piece of oilcloth to protect its contents from the pervasive damp. With trembling hands, Thomas lifted the cloth. Inside, nestled amongst a few more pitifully preserved supplies, a half-empty, moldering tin of biscuits, a small, heavily worn, leather-bound New Testament. Different from the larger Bible he'd found by the tree, its pages softened with use, were several old VHS tapes, video cassettes. His heart leaped with a jolt of shocked recognition. His father had owned a camcorder, an old, bulky model he'd used with almost boyish enthusiasm to film family holidays, Thomas's school plays, church picnics. Had he managed to bring it here? Or had he found a way to record things even in this desperate exile, a final attempt to leave his mark, his truth? The tapes were labeled, not with titles of happy family memories, but with stark, single words, handwritten in his father's familiar script, the ink faded but still legible. The meeting, their faces, my testimony, the betrayal. The dates scribbled beneath each word corresponded with the period after his disappearance, stretching over several agonizing weeks. The last tape, the one at the bottom of the crate, was simply labeled, "If I am found," a chilling premonition, a message from a man who knew his time was running out. Finding a way to play them here, in the suffocating darkness of this earthen cell, was impossible. He would have to take them. He gathered them carefully, reverently, his mind reeling from the implications. These tapes, they were the missing pieces, the voice from beyond the silence, the evidence his father had risked everything to create. They held the power to confirm the unthinkable, to expose the men who had orchestrated his father's downfall and then presided over his false funeral. As he turned to leave, his light caught something else, something small and metallic tucked into a crevice in the earthen wall, almost invisible against the dark soil. A small cheap cassette recorder, the kind used for dictation, and beside it, nestled protectively, a single microcassette, its delicate tape spooled tight. This, he realized with a jolt, might be even more immediate, more personal, more damning than the videos. He pocketed it, along with the VHS tapes, a profound sense of dread and grim purpose settling over him. He was no longer just a son searching for answers about a lost parent. He was an inheritor of a dangerous truth, a truth that had cost his father everything, a truth that now demanded its own reckoning. The climb back out of the chamber felt like an ascent from a grave, the daylight almost blinding after the Stygian gloom, the ordinary sounds of the forest, birdsong, the rustle of wind in the leaves, unnaturally loud, almost deafening, after the tomb-like silence below. He felt as if he had aged years in those few minutes underground, the weight of his father's secret life pressing down on him. Back in the sterile anonymity of a rented motel room miles from his childhood town, a place deliberately chosen for its lack of connection to his past, the insistent hum of the aging air conditioner, a jarring counterpoint to the frantic thrumming of his own heart, Thomas finally confronted the ghosts on the tapes. He'd had to buy a cheap, second-hand VCR from a pawn shop, the transaction feeling illicit, clandestine, as if he were purchasing forbidden knowledge. The first tape, labeled "The Meeting," crackled to life with a burst of angry static, then resolved into a grainy, poorly lit image. It was his father, Alistair, his face etched with an exhaustion and a grim, hunted determination Thomas had never seen in life, not even in those last strained weeks. He was speaking directly to the camera, his voice low, urgent, raspy, as if afraid of being overheard even in the supposed sanctuary of his hidden chamber. "If you are watching this," Alistair began, his eyes, shadowed and intense, looking directly into the lens, and by extension, across the chasm of years, into Thomas's soul, "it means I have failed in my efforts, or I have been silenced permanently. But the truth must not die with me. It is too important." He went on to describe, in meticulous, painful detail, the corruption he had uncovered within the church, a rot that went far deeper than mere financial misdeeds, though that was certainly part of it, systematic embezzlement from church funds, donations meant for charity and outreach, siphoned off by a cabal of senior church figures, men whose names Thomas recognized with a sickening lurch, men who had preached piety and benevolence from the pulpit while their hands were busy in the collection plate, lining their own pockets. But it was more insidious than just money. Alistair spoke of a deeper moral decay, a spiritual gangrene, power abused, dissenting voices within the church systematically discredited or removed, inconvenient truths buried, a network of influence that extended beyond the church walls, into local businesses, even into local politics, creating a web of complicity and silence. He named them, his voice steady despite the tremor Thomas could see in his hands. Deacon Thorne, with his benevolent smile and grasping, avaricious hands. Elder Miles, the church treasurer, whose meticulously kept books were, Alistair revealed, a masterpiece of fraudulent accounting, whose pronouncements on fiscal responsibility now seemed like grotesque parodies. Even Reverend Davies from the neighboring parish, a man Alistair had once considered a friend, a mentor, implicated in covering up uncomfortable truths to protect the institution's pristine, unblemished image. They called it protecting the flock. Alistair said, a bitter, humorless twist to his lips. What they meant was protecting themselves, their comfortable positions, their edifice of lies, their little kingdom built on deceit. He described how he had stumbled upon the evidence, piece by painstaking piece, how his initial discreet inquiries, his gentle probing, had been met with veiled threats, Then with outright hostility, with warnings to mind his own business, to not stir up trouble. The scandal that had supposedly driven him to suicide had been, he explained, with a chilling calmness, a carefully constructed fiction, a preemptive strike designed to discredit him, to destroy his reputation before he could go public with his devastating findings. They had manufactured evidence, coerced false testimonies from vulnerable individuals, all to paint him as a fallen man, a hypocrite, someone whose accusations, should he ever make them, would be easily dismissed as the desperate lies of a disgraced sinner. Thomas watched, transfixed, his own breath catching in his throat as his father laid bare the intricate conspiracy, his voice sometimes trembling with suppressed outrage, sometimes heavy with a profound sorrow for the betrayal by men he had loved and served alongside. He showed documents to the camera, copies of ledgers with incriminating entries circled in red, letters with damning signatures, pages of his own handwritten notes meticulously detailing their schemes. Proof. Tangible proof, recorded for a future he might not live to see. Each tape built upon the last, a grim crescendo of revelation. Their faces showed furtive, grainy footage, apparently taken with a hidden camera his father must have somehow acquired or ingeniously rigged, of clandestine meetings between the accused men in shadowy backrooms, their expressions unguarded, contemptuous, their conversations, though muffled and indistinct, hinting at their collusion, their fear of exposure. My testimony was a direct, almost sermon-like address, where Alistair, with some of the fire and fervor of his old preaching days, but now imbued with a desperate, hunted energy, laid out his theological and moral case against them, citing Scripture, appealing not to human justice, which he clearly despaired of, but to a higher, divine justice. The pain of betrayal was a raw, open wound in his voice when he spoke of those he had trusted, those who had smiled to his face while plotting his destruction behind his back. The air in the cheap motel room grew heavy, thick with the weight of these long-held secrets, with the palpable presence of his father's righteous anger and profound grief. The image of his father, not as a weak man succumbing to shame, but as a fighter, a whistleblower, a man of incredible, albeit ultimately futile, courage, burned itself into Thomas's mind, eradicating the tainted image he had carried for so long. The son felt a swell of fierce, protective pride, an emotion so potent it almost choked him, quickly followed by a chilling, visceral understanding of the terrible danger his father had faced, the insidious, powerful forces that had arrayed themselves against him, the danger that had, inevitably, inexorably, consumed him. He was watching a man sign his own death warrant, one frame at a time. The final VHS tape, the one ominously labeled "If I Am Found," was shorter than the others, the image shakier, the light from whatever source his father used even dimmer, casting long, dancing shadows that made his face appear almost spectral. Alistair looked directly into the camera, his face gaunt, his eyes cavernous, haunted but strangely resolute, as if he had passed beyond fear into a realm of grim acceptance. "They are closing in," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, a dry rustling sound. "I hear them more often now in the woods. Their voices, the dogs, they are no longer searching blindly. They know I am out here. Perhaps they even know of this place, this sanctuary, or tomb." He paused, taking a ragged, painful breath that seemed to catch in his lungs. "I do not know what they intend. To reason with me? Unlikely. To silence me permanently, I suspect. To ensure the story ends with my disgrace, with my convenient suicide." He looked down for a moment, his shoulders slumping, and when he looked back at the lens, there were unshed tears glistening in his eyes, reflecting the meager light. "Thomas," he whispered, the name a raw ache, a sound that tore through Thomas, bridging the 26 years of silence in an instant. "My son, my beloved boy, forgive me. Forgive me for not being stronger, for for not finding a way to beat them, for leaving you with this shadow, this shame. Know that I never willingly abandoned you. Know that I loved you, and your mother, Eleanor, more than words can say. More than life itself. Thomas felt his own tears fall then, hot and unrestrained, blurring the image of his father on the flickering screen. This was not a suicide note. It was a farewell from a man facing his executioners, a last testament from the edge of the abyss. The tape didn't show them coming. It ended abruptly, a jarring cut to a screen of hissing static, as if the camera had been suddenly dropped or violently shut off. But the implication was terrifyingly clear. They had found him. They had come to the prayer chamber, his last refuge. What happened next? The tapes offered no further visual, but the small microcassette, the one he'd found tucked almost invisibly into the earthen wall, provided a horrifying, sickeningly intimate coda. His hands shaking so badly he could barely manage it, he inserted it into the cheap player he'd also purchased, its tiny speakers wholly inadequate for the enormity of what he was about to hear. The audio quality was poor, filled with background hiss, the muffled sound of rustling fabric, and the chillingly close sound of his father's labored breathing, but Alistair's voice was unmistakable. Though weaker now, breathless, laced with a terror that made Thomas's blood run cold. It wasn't a recording made for posterity like the VHS tapes, but an accidental, or perhaps desperate, final activation of the recorder in his pocket. No, please. I have evidence. I can prove everything. People need to know. Please, brothers. His father's voice, pleading, desperate, stripped of all defiance, reduced to sheer, animal fear. Then other voices, muffled by the recording, distorted by their own rage, but one was chillingly, sickeningly familiar, even through the static. Deacon Thorne, his tone not benevolent now, but cold, hard, utterly without mercy. You should have stayed silent, Pastor. You brought this on yourself. You should have taken the easy way out we offered you. Some men just don't know when they're beaten. There were sounds of a struggle, a sickening thud, a choked cry from his father, then a terrible, gurgling silence. A few more moments of rustling, heavy breathing from more than one person, a muttered curse, then a sharp click as the recorder was presumably unknowingly switched off by a fumbling hand. Thomas sat in stunned, absolute silence, the cheap art on the motel room walls and the faded, sun-bleached curtains blurring around him into a meaningless swirl of color. His father hadn't just been silenced metaphorically by a manufactured scandal, he had been murdered. Or at least taken from that place to a fate from which he never returned, his body disposed of like refuse. The scandal was a lie, the suicide was a lie. His father had been a victim, brutally silenced by the very men who had then stood before the congregation with solemn faces and offered prayers for his troubled soul, the men who had comforted his grieving wife and son. The sheer, calculated, diabolical evil of it was staggering, almost incomprehensible. The twist wasn't just that his father was innocent of the scandal that had destroyed his name, it was that his disappearance was a cold, deliberate act of violence, orchestrated by pillars of the community, men who had continued to live their lives, respected and admired, while Alistair Finch's true story rotted in the earth. His bones, perhaps lying undiscovered in some forgotten corner of the same forest that had briefly been his sanctuary. The weight of this knowledge was immense, a crushing, suffocating burden. He now understood the depth of the darkness his father had spoken of in that last prophetic sermon, a darkness that had not just infiltrated the sanctuary, but had consumed the very men sworn to protect it, turning them into monsters cloaked in piety. The men who shook his hand as a boy, who offered him hollow condolences for his lost father, their hands stained with a truth far more terrible than anyone in that trusting, grieving town could have ever conceived. Thomas didn't sleep that night nor the next. The dawn found him sitting by the cheap motel window, the VHS tapes and the microcassette laid out before him on the worn formica table, like sacred relics, like instruments of a terrible, belated judgment. The first weak rays of sun, tinged with the gray, indifferent light of a new day, did little to dispel the profound darkness that had settled in his soul. A darkness that felt as deep and cold as the earthen chamber in the woods. What now? What was he supposed to do with this horrifying, explosive truth? Go to the police? 26 years had passed. Deacon Thorne, if he was even still alive, would be an old man now, frail, perhaps even senile, his memory conveniently faded. Elder Miles, Alistair's tapes had revealed, had died a decade ago, eulogized as a paragon of civic virtue, his funeral attended by half the town. Reverend Davies had retired, moved to another state, disappearing into the anonymity of a sunnier climate. The original documents Alistair had mentioned, the physical proof he had gathered at such terrible cost, were likely long gone, destroyed with the same ruthless efficiency that had disposed of their author. These tapes, this horrifying audio snippet, would they be enough? Would anyone believe this convoluted, horrifying story against the established narrative, against the fading memories of a town that had long since moved on, that had healed around the scar of Pastor Finch's supposed disgrace? The kingdom his father had tried to expose, the network of power and deceit, was deeply entrenched, its roots running through the very fabric of the community, intertwined with respected names and cherished institutions. To attempt to unearth it now felt like an impossible battle, perhaps even a dangerous one, stirring a hornet's nest that had lain dormant for a quarter of a century. He thought of his father, alone in that earthen cell, fighting with his words, his faith, his small flickering camera light against an encroaching, overwhelming darkness. He had lost. But in that loss, in that desperate, courageous chronicle of his final weeks, he had left behind the truth. And Thomas now held it, a heavy, burning coal in his hands. Justice, in the legal sense, the kind that involved courts and convictions, felt like a distant, perhaps unattainable mirage. The men responsible might never face a human court, might carry their secrets to their own comfortable graves. But the truth was a different kind of reckoning, a more personal, more profound form of justice. He drove back to the forest, not to the hidden chamber, which now felt like a desecrated grave, but to the lightning-struck tree where this final, agonizing chapter of his father's story had begun. The Bible, his father's silent companion in those last terrible months, felt warm in his hands, almost alive. He knelt where he had knelt before, the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves no longer just a smell, but a testament to time, to secrets kept, to eventual, painful revelation. He wouldn't rebury it. This Bible, with its desperate annotations, its impossible dates, its faint scent of fear and faith, was his father's voice, his father's vindication. He would keep it, he would carry it. The world might never know the full story of Pastor Alistair Finch, the man who fought the wolves within his own flock and paid the ultimate price, but Thomas knew. And in that knowing, there was a profound, sorrowful peace, a quiet catharsis that eased the ache he had carried for so long. The shame he had carried for his father was gone, replaced by a quiet, aching pride for the brave, flawed, ultimately heroic man he had finally come to understand. He stood, the forest around him no longer a place of childhood games or hidden terrors, but a silent witness, a vast green cathedral, a guardian of a tragic, hard-won truth. As he walked away from the scarred tree, the canopy above filtering the morning light into shards of gold and shadow, he felt the weight of his father's story settle upon him, not as a burden to crush him, but as a legacy to honor, a torch to carry. The silence of the woods remained, deep and ancient, but for Thomas it was no longer empty, no longer accusatory. It was filled with the faint, lingering echo of a final whispered prayer, a testament to a faith that, even in the face of unimaginable betrayal and ultimate despair, had not been entirely extinguished. The path ahead was uncertain, shadowed by the knowledge he now possessed, but he walked it with a new clarity, his father's courage, a quiet, steady strength within him. A compass pointing not towards vengeance which felt hollow and inadequate, but towards the enduring, resilient power of a truth finally, irrevocably, brought to light, even if only for one grieving son, in the heart of a silent forest.